Hello and welcome. I am Humphrey Hawksley, and we are at a strange evening, bewitching hour for our Goldster Inside Story today. And I'm actually not quite sure why, but we are, and it's fantastic to be here because we're going to reach far back into the long ago Middle Ages where there were no cell phones, indeed no phones at all, no electricity. What medicine was there? And there was certainly no around the world in 24 hours flights, and there were no podcast listening. But did things get on top of people like we hear they are today? And what can we learn about the less complicated ways of life when mortgages, fuel bills, and 24-hour news were simply not around at all? Well, what we've got today is a journey, as I said, far back in there, because this pixie-like figure wrapped in black headphones and sitting in a red box is a live wire bundle of knowledge and energy, and she has written a book called simply How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life. And I said to her yesterday as we were chatting that does that mean living with three basic monastic principles, which are poverty, chastity, and obedience? What was her answer? We'll see. Because my guest is steeped in the cultures of medievalism. What exactly is that? And another question to ask, and what wisdom can we really take from there and help us with whatever challenges we are facing today? We have a true treasure of a guest this evening because she hosts two creative podcasts, the Medieval podcast and the Extra Medieval, which get thousands of listeners as soon as they pop out of virtuality, if that's the right phrase. And her earlier book, The Middle Ages and the Modern World, Facts and Fiction, and other writing. Her other writing is used in schools and colleges across Canada, which is incidentally, and I didn't tell you, where she is sitting now, just outside of Toronto. And she has designed, if anybody is interested, the Medieval Masters Class for Creators, and that's an online course for novelists, game developers, and screenplay writers, and anything like that. So anything you want to know about medievalism or about de-stressing your modern life, ask away. And without further ado, welcome Daniéle Cybulskie to Goldster Inside Story.
Thank you so much for having me. That was a wonderful introduction, and I hope to live up to it.
Now, it's not polite to ask a lady her age, but in medieval times, what was the life expectancy of a human being?
I think that we're looking at an average of around 40 something, but
Okay.
yes, but that means that that's averaging out everybody, right? So you have people that lived into their 80s and you have people that died very young. But I think if you averaged it all out, it would end up being in the 40s. But many people lived much longer than that.
Okay, so you wouldn't have what everybody's saying now is an aging problem because people were dying off in what we would consider to be our youth. Now, when exactly were the medieval times? What dates are we talking about?
That's a really good question, and it is contentious among historians. But for me, I'm talking about the fall of Rome. So just around 500 to about the time of Henry VIII, so around 1500. So it's a 1,000-year period. And I just look at Europe. So it's a whole continent and a whole millennium. There is a lot to learn and know.
There's a heap to learn. And what were the Dark Ages?
So the Dark Ages, we don't use this anymore because it is prejudicial. It makes people think that nothing was happening when really there was a lot of stuff that was happening. But the Dark Ages is what people now refer to as the early Middle Ages. So that's the time from about 500, the fall of Rome, to about 1000, or people in the UK might think of it more precisely as 1066 is a nice number to remember. Okay. That's around the time of the Dark Ages.
Okay. And is that the same as the Middle Ages?
The Middle Ages is the entire period, and that was called the Middle Ages right afterwards, when people were being a little bit snobby about thinking that they were better than this time that came before. They were like, there's the classical age, and then there's now, which is amazing, and then there's the Middle Ages. So that's the whole period.
Now, in a moment, I want to dig deeply into your book about living like a monk and getting wisdom from the way that they live. But I have a question for our audience at the moment, which is a nugget in your book. And any answer is going to be a great answer, but there is a specific answer. When you're choosing your food, what is the difference between eating meat and sex and eating fish and sex in the monastic culture? anybody that's got any, and you know, who knows that? I didn't know it a few minutes ago, so any answer will make us laugh. Put it in the chat, and also ask Daniéle anything you want about anything, and we can go off my ridiculous script and have a decent conversation. Now, in the Middle Ages at all, was there a period, or when did people start having the sort of things that stress us out? So bank mortgages, fuel bills, buses not running on time, health service. Was there that worry culture like we have at all?
I think so. I think that's something that is common to humanity, and that is a real thread throughout all of my work, is that I think that human beings have not changed very much in several thousand years, and so there's always worry. And in fact, they had probably more worries than we do, because they always had to be thinking about what food they're going to put on the table. And while our grocery bills are astronomical right now, I'm sure it's the same in the UK as it is here in Canada, we can still go to the store and usually get something there. We're not worrying about getting something out of the ground, but people were paying rent and they were worried about their food. And of course, they're worried about weather and things that we are worried about today. So I think it's pretty consistent that we are worriers as human beings, because we're always trying to make ourselves comfortable and well fed. So I think that's just consistent over time.
And taking that question a little further, a lot of the worry that we're getting in the past 10 years or so has been social media. So you're worried as if the person on social media is doing better than you, or if you're being trashed or whatever it is. They would live in their tight communities, wouldn't they? So that would be a different sort of sense of place.
Yeah, I think that social media is a really important thing to think about, because with social media, at least for me, sometimes you're trying to bear witness to all the news in the world. And so you take on a lot more bad feelings or a lot more worries than you might have if you were just unplugged from that. So I do think that people did travel a lot more than we think they did. They lived in a small community, but they would travel for work or pilgrimage and all that stuff. And I think you would always want to keep up with the Joneses to a certain point. But perhaps in your villages there aren't as many Joneses, right? So perhaps they were not as weighed down with the weight of so many people as we are in social media.
Right, so it's a slightly different, and of course communications weren't as instant. Emma, wonderful Emma to see you here. Can you repeat the question, Humphrey? Yes, because it is one of the funnest questions we've had. What is the difference between meat and sex and fish and sex? And that's meat and fish as in a culinary element of those two things. What is the difference between meat and sex and fish and sex? I'll put it in the chat in a second. If I can find the chat and everything. So you had a different sort of thing. I just want to check exactly what a monk is. And when I was thinking of this question, I thought in Robin Hood, I think all of us know the Robin Hood character, there is a character in there called Friar Tuck. Now, was he a monk?
No, he was not a monk. And this is a really good question, and something that I had to tease apart when I started writing about monks, because I'm a generalist. I study like this entire period, this entire continent. And I took on this project in part because I wanted to learn more about monks. So the difference between monks and friars is that monks are meant to stay in an enclosed community. So they are both what we call regular clergy, in that they're clergy, but they follow a rule. So that's where we get regula from. That's where regular comes from. But monks are supposed to stay in an enclosed community. They might go out to the market. They might go out to work in a hospital, but they're mostly supposed to stay put. Whereas friars are meant to go out and preach. So when we're talking about friars, we're talking about Dominicans, we're talking about Franciscans. Those are the people that would walk around and preach for food, beg for food. Whereas Benedictines, for example, are the ones that stay in a monastery and they don't wander around. So it makes sense for Friar Tuck to be wandering around because he is a friar, but he is also a person who has taken those vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And sometimes when you see an image of Friar Tuck, he has 3 knots in his belt, which symbolize those 3 vows. And that would suggest he's probably a Franciscan, but it depends on the artist.
Okay, so the traveling monks or religious figures that we know about, Francis of Assisi and people like that, they were friars, were they?
Yes, usually.
Yeah. And there is a liqueur that I had as a young man, I don't drink it now, called Benedictine. that was, is that from the monastery you're talking about?
Well, monasteries were very involved in doing things like creating wine, for example, or mead, because they always have bees, and even beer brewing as well, because there wasn't really a restriction. Saint Benedict in his rule says, we have told monks they're not really supposed to be drinking wine, but since no one listens to that, okay, you can have your wine, just don't go to excess.
So you can, so you have to be obedient, you have to be poor, and you have to be chaste,
That's
but you can
right.
be drunk.
Well, you're not supposed to be drunk. It's funny because there's something called the Penitential of Theodore, which is not necessarily aimed at monks, but there are some things in it that are. And that was to give you penance. It was a kind of a guideline to give you penance for whatever you might have done. And there are restrictions in there for if you are drunk and if you have vomited. And there are even things like, have you vomited up the communion wafer? Because if you've done that, then you really need to have some penance and you need to fast for a while. But there are some exceptions in it saying if you're being asked to drink along with the abbot and you get too drunk, that's okay. If you get too drunk when you're celebrating a feast day, that's okay too. But don't get drunk on the regular. That is a bad thing. It's evidence of gluttony, and that's a sin.
Okay, so you can get drunk with the abbot, but you can't get drunk with your mates. And
Yeah.
where were the nuns when all this was going on? Were they just next door, or were they miles away? And were they living obedience and chastity and poverty?
Yeah, that's a really good question. They were living very similar lives, nuns, but they weren't ordained, right? So they couldn't go out and preach. And they always had to have a priest come in and conduct their mass because they could not be ordained as women. But it's a good question. Sometimes their convents would be separate and sometimes they would be together. And what's really interesting is when you sometimes have a double monastery with monks and nuns together, then often you'd have an abbess in charge instead of an abbot, which I think is something really, really cool and interesting.
Okay, so you would have an abbess in charge, because we in Britain, and I'm sure all over, you've all got this constant stuff about women priests and women vicars and all that sort of thing. But back then it was just, and they had the same not the same level, but they had an authority in the church.
So the abbess would be in charge of her nuns and in charge of the monks if she was in charge of the whole thing together, but she could never be ordained.
Okay, that's okay. And I have one thing. We're talking about the period here. Henry VIII, that was our king that had six wives and left Rome and left Europe, as we've just done. He also dissolved the monasteries, didn't he? So
yes,
tell us what was leading up to that and why that happened.
Well, the simple reason was he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn and he couldn't do it. He needed to annul his marriage. And there was no reason for that. There was no consanguinity, which was a problem, right? If they were too closely related. And in the Middle Ages, you could get married just by saying, I'd like to marry you, and then having sex afterwards. If you consummated it at any time afterwards, if you had said, like, I'd like to marry you next year, but then you had sex afterwards, you were legally married. So there were some binding things that kept you together, right? And so as much as Henry wanted to unknot himself from Catherine of Aragon, he couldn't do it. So he broke from Rome, created his own Church of England with his own rules, divorced her, and then was able to marry Anne Boleyn. But he used to be called the champion of the church. So I think the Pope was a little upset by that, more than a little upset.
Well, Europe's always upset when we leave it, and then we go back again, and then we leave it again. But the actual dissolution of the monasteries, where he ripped down these buildings, was that directly connected to the leaving Rome, or would that have happened anyway because he thought the monasteries were too powerful?
No, I don't think it could have happened without this break from Rome, because if you are still obedient to the Pope, then you have to respect the monks and the nuns who are following the Catholic Church. But if you break from that and you start being Protestant, then you can say, this is now superstition. We are going to dissolve the monasteries and we are handily going to take all their money. And in fact, one of the reasons that people are so down on the Middle Ages is because of Protestantism, because when people are like, we are now Protestant, and those people back then were Catholic, then it's easy to put them down, the people came before, as being superstitious and not as smart. So it's kind of Protestant propaganda that also makes the Middle Ages have such a bad reputation still today.
Okay, because Sue Townley, I think, reflects your point. Didn't he also want the money?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, why not? Because people were paying to the church tithes, and they were paying to make sure that, that their souls might reach heaven. They might be paying for masses to be said. So and then the abbeys also rented out property. They owned a lot of property and rented it. So they did have a lot of money, which could be sometimes dicey because they were supposed to be impoverished, right? So when you see a fat friar or a fat monk in this medieval context, it's often a political commentary saying you're supposed to be impoverished and you're supposed to be like fasting a lot. This is a commentary on the fact that they're hypocritical.
So it happened. It was also, though, I don't know, political revolutionary thing, because it did dilute the power of the church, didn't it?
Yeah.
And
In England,
increase the power of the monarchy.
yes, in England for sure. But there were rumblings of Protestantism on the continent as well. But it definitely was a big break in England.
And when did Luther do Wittenberg? Because that was about the tithes, wasn't it? That created the whole Protestant Reformation. That was around the same time, or a little late, much later, wasn't it?
It's just after the time that I study. So in the 16th century, and I like to cut it off at 1500, only because I'm already dealing with 1,000 years,
Okay, so I think we've grounded ourselves now in what it was like to live in those days. I once had a dinner with some medievalists, some of your colleagues, I guess, or counterparts, and I said, what was the biggest difference? I asked, what was the biggest difference between now and then? And they said to me that living in pain was what they had to get used to. Were they right?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember Dan Jones and I were having a beer one time, and he asked me that question, that time travel question that we all get asked, right? When would you go back to? And neither of us wanted to go back very far at all because of medicine, right? So they did have medicine, and they did have ways that they could take care of things like bacterial infection. To prevent that, you'd put honey on your wound, for example, or you'd put alcohol on it, and this would work pretty well. But you didn't have a reliable anesthesia, and sometimes you'd have to amputate. But antibiotics are a huge game changer, and the Black Death, for example, came back around just every few years until the advent of antibiotics in the 20th century. So yeah, I don't want to go back to that time, and definitely not without antibiotics.
What happened if you got a toothache?
You would go and see the barber surgeon, and he would pull it.
He
pull your
just
tooth.
Rip the tooth out.
Yeah. So they had different things that they would try to help you if you had cavities or something. They thought that those were caused by tooth worms. And it makes a lot of sense, right? Because they make a hole like a worm does in an apple. And so they try to lure them out sometimes with like a candle or other things. But we know that they're not actually worms, so that didn't work very well. But basically, if your teeth were going bad, they had to be pulled.
Yeah. And if you only live till 40, then I guess it's not as bad. Emma says, before we go down that road too long, Emma says, oh, I want to know, you really want to know this. How did your own interest in medieval history begin?
That's a really good question. And there should be a really sophisticated answer, but the real answer is Walt Disney. I really loved Sleeping Beauty. And it's funny because, well, I loved Robin Hood as well. I think there's going to be people on this call that love that fox too, right? But I mean, Sleeping Beauty was based on 14th century art. So it has that real look and feel of it. And then when I got older and started to study the Middle Ages and really have this sense that we are the same as these people that lived a long time ago. There's this line in Sleeping Beauty where Prince Philip says he's going to marry a commoner, and his dad gets very upset, and he says, "Now, father, this is the 14th century nowadays." and that is exactly my feeling about this. Is everybody who's living thinks like this is the modern time. And so when we think back and we put ourselves in those shoes, then I think we can understand it better.
And you studied it at what university? At PhD? Are you doctorate? I mean, why are you so knowledgeable? There's not on the staff of Friar Tuck sort of that sort of thing.
I am a master, not a doctor. So yeah, I thought about going back to get my PhD, but there aren't any jobs. So I was like, well, I was teaching at community college, and then I got my degree. It's technically in English because I thought there would be more jobs that way. I'm a pretty practical person, but I cheated on my English degree with all crossover courses to medieval studies. So I'm basically one Shakespeare credit away from having a degree in medieval studies. But then I had my first baby, and I was at home thinking, like, I really miss these discussions I used to have in graduate school about all this history. And I really felt like we have a misunderstanding about what this period was like. So I started to write for the internet, started to write a blog, which I called the 5-Minute Medievalist. And then that got picked up by a site called medievalist.net. From there, I self-published a book of my articles, and then I started to get publishing deals, and that is how I got here.
Oh, and you do your podcasts how often now?
Oh, weekly. And it's not
one a
because
week?
I'm a hero. I do one of each every week. It's not because I'm a hero. It's because I thought if I didn't make myself do it every week, I would just procrastinate and I wouldn't keep it up. So yeah, I do both podcasts every week.
We've got those the podcast links in the chat, and I will repost them in the chat during the show. I now want to get on to how to live like a monk as opposed to as a monk.
Yes.
You've chosen like a monk instead of like a friar. So you're talking about the people that are in the monastery. Mm-hmm. Describe to us the types of people that become monks. Why do they become monks, and how they live? Give us an idea of their day.
Yeah, so I think that a lot of people have this idea that if you were not the first son, if you're the second son, you were like shoved into the monastery, which is not really how it happened. Most people who joined the monastery had a vocation, so they felt called to do it. So early on, you might have some children called oblates that would be given to the monastery, but that was in the early Middle Ages, and the church had an issue with that because you were meant to choose this life. It wasn't meant to be thrust upon you. It wasn't meant to be like a punishment or anything like that. So most people had a vocation, and they would join it perhaps in their teenage years or even later, or into retirement. Perhaps you'd been a knight for many years and you're like, I just want a retirement. I want to pass my castle on to my kids, and I'm going to retire to the monastery. So that's how they would do that. They would have a year-long trial period where they would see if it was a good fit, because you have to make sure that the community works if you're going to be enclosed, right? You have to make sure that everyone gets along. So after that year, then they would take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So a monastic day meant you would pray every few hours. It wasn't following the 24-hour clock like we do. It was the canonical hours, which were divided over the course of daylight. So they would be praying, and then they would stop and they might have a meeting. They would have a meeting in the morning saying, here's everybody's assignments for the day. Does anyone have any sins they want to confess? Does anyone have any sins that someone else did that they need to tell us about? Have a meeting in the morning. Then they would pray again. Then they would work. They would each have tasks that were given to them based on their ability. So if you had, for example, been a shoemaker and then you were retired to the monastery, you might be asked to make shoes. You might be asked to make books. You might be asked to clean up, things like that. Then you'd pray again, then you'd eat, and then you'd work and pray. And so it was like that over the course of the day. And when we're talking about obedience, that meant the abbot said, you're doing this, and whether you liked it or not, that's what you are doing. Right. So yeah, it's when I talk about living like a monk, I don't say living as a monk, because living as a monk is to choose a very difficult lifestyle where you are giving up your autonomy. You're giving up a lot of sleep, and you're giving up maybe the pleasures of your life. That's hard, and it's meant to be hard in service of God.
And the monastery itself, which, I mean, I've seen the ruins of them all over Britain. I mean, you had that, they lived there. How much did they interact with the community? Were they like the doctors of the community, the social workers of the community, or were they completely cut off?
Well, they were supposed to be cut off, and the longer and more trustworthy you were like part of the community, the more you might be given a job that was public facing. Let's say you might be asked to be the gatekeeper who's greeting the pilgrims, because monasteries would host any travelers as if they were Jesus, right? Welcome them and take care of them. So, you might be the gatekeeper who's dealing with that. You might be somebody who's working with the abbot to take care of these pilgrims. So that's public facing. You might be working in a hospital. You might be going to market. You might be going to a different place. But that's usually if you have been in the monastery long enough that they know you're not going to just go and sin when you're out there, right? They don't ask the young ones to do that. You have to be trustworthy.
And you use a phrase in it called ad meliora.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by that?
That means towards better things. So,
And was
so
that
bettering yourself.
is that your phrase, or is that the monk's mission statement?
That is a phrase that I and the editor work together to build. Like, what is it we're trying to accomplish with this book? We're trying to accomplish everybody working towards betterment. And so that's where that comes from.
Okay. Emma asks, and I think you might have answered, given a choice between medieval and modern life, which one would you choose?
Absolutely modern life. Absolutely modern life. I live in Canada, and I gotta say, central heating is so important to my life. I do not want to live in a time where I can't get warm, where I can't get antibiotics. And I mean, to be fair, I think that women's lives were better in the Middle Ages than they were in some later periods, but it's never been a better time to be a woman. We actually can speak for ourselves in ways that we couldn't for millennia.
Just go back on that. You're saying that in the Middle Ages, women's sort of life was better than later on. So
Yeah, it was.
What happened? How come things went
Well,
backwards?
The early modern period has a lot to answer for. So when we're talking about things like witch trials, right, or things like scolds bridals or things like that, that's early modern. Like, that is the time of Shakespeare. That is later periods. And there were times when you had people who wanted to control women more. So during the Middle Ages, it was expected that women were going to work and take care of the children too, but do work. And there are times later on, during Jane Austen's time, perhaps, like, you were not supposed to do anything, right? You weren't allowed to really work.
Yes.
Yeah, just get married. And so I think that there was a bit more freedom in the Middle Ages, and certainly the clothes were more comfortable. There was no corset, so no whalebones.
So in the great human development, human condition, what would have brought about that backward step? That was it men trying to control more things, worried about their self-esteem? What was it?
Yeah. I mean, I don't really know. There was certainly a huge amount of hysteria. So when we're talking about witches, for example, it's not until the latest part of the Middle Ages that anybody really cared about that. And yet, in the time of James Stewart, for example, or like in the 1600s, there are witch trials and there's burnings, and hangings in Salem, for example. And so, yeah, I think it has a lot to do with control. And when you are suppressing half the population, there is a lot more power for you to have, I think. But honestly, the early modern period is not my jam. So you have to ask modernists.
I just want to, for my own satisfaction, take you way out of your comfort zone.
Yeah, thanks.
We're talking about the spread of the way women are treated. When you see what's happening in Afghanistan or Iran nowadays, and I'd say the Me Too movement and all that, do you sort of reflect back? Do you think, well, this is how it was then and this is how it is now, and have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I constantly am reflecting on what is the same and what is different, and the interactions between people, I think, are pretty consistent, and the greed for power can be pretty consistent, I think, over human periods. Now, I don't know enough about the state of women in places like Afghanistan. I know that things are a struggle for them, but even that has shifted over the last 50 years. They had more freedom, and then they had less, and then they had more, and then they have less. So, I think, as you're saying, when we look at the broad arc, things are better for most women on the planet than they were, at any other time.
But the point you made was very interesting, that over generations it can ebb and flow back and forth on.
Yeah.
of thing. Celia has a question which is going to bring us back to our main question that nobody has had the courage to answer yet. But the main question is, what is the difference between meat and sex and fish and sex? Celia is, and maybe you can give a hint as you answer this question. Celia is, were the monks completely self-sufficient, growing food and rearing animals?
As much as possible. They tried to be as self-sufficient as possible. And as you mentioned, Humphrey, like if you look around the United Kingdom, you'll see the ruins, and some of them are Cistercian ruins. And Cistercians were the ones who tried to be as self-sufficient and as separate as possible. So they tried to make life hard for themselves. And I think it's Cistercians in Scotland who petitioned the Pope to say, can we wear hats in church in winter? Because it's really cold. It's cold in Scotland in winter, right? But in the rule, it doesn't say you're allowed to wear a hat. So they had to ask the Pope. So most of the time, Benedictines especially, I think, were more integrated with the community, right? It's hard to raise animals and do all the crops and stuff yourself. When a monastery owned a lot of land, they could get stuff like that as rent, right? So you might get things like eels as rent for the season of Lent, especially when it was fish days, or you might get like chickens, or you might get grain. So they tried to be self-sufficient, but they were never really completely separate unless they were on, some of those Irish islands where they were completely cut off.
Which were the monks that couldn't speak?
Well, if you follow the rule of St. Benedict, you're not supposed to speak most of the time. So you're supposed to be silent almost all the time. And then when you do speak at certain times, you're supposed to be not speaking about anything frivolous. You're just supposed to be talking about faith and perhaps the books you've read.
We'd be hopeless, wouldn't we? I mean, we'd be out of a job.
This is why I'm saying don't live.
Podcast would be finished, yes, under Benedictine rule.
Don't live as a monk, live like a monk.
Like a monk. So in the book, we're going to go to some various sort of things that the monks do. You talk about green space.
Yeah.
The return to humanity's origins and how it represents healing and nourishment for the soul and the body. Tell us what it did then for the monks and how it could do, or what it could do for us today.
Okay, so in the center of a cloister, so the cloister is the place where only the monks are supposed to go. So a monastery might have more buildings, outbuildings, but the cloister is where the monks are supposed to stay. So this has their dormitory, their refectory where they eat, the chapel, all of those things. And in the center, they're usually arranged in a square. In the center is something called a garth, which is supposed to be a green lawn. And so if you were wandering around a church or a ruined monastery in England, for example, you'll see there's usually a square lawn, and that's meant to be green. And the thinkers of the day said that green was meant to rest your eyes. So if you are inside working on manuscripts all day, for example, you're meant to go outside, and the green, they thought it was halfway between black and white. So it would refresh your eyes. And it's really funny because one of the reasons I took on this book, this idea was pitched to me, and I thought, this is bringing together all of these things I like, is because I like to read stuff about positive psychology. And we have learned that looking at plants refreshes us to the point at which you can have a fake plant or even a picture of a plant. And if you stare at that as a 30-second break, you will feel better than if you're staring at a brick wall. And it's really interesting. This is just part of our human psychology. And the monks had already figured this out, that you will be refreshed if you are walking on grass, if you're looking at flowers. And for them, of course, it's attached to the natural world. It's attached to ideas of God and the Garden of Eden, for example. But one of the things I think is interesting about monks is they sometimes had a cemetery in their orchard. So sometimes you'd actually have monks that were nourishing the community by being buried in the orchard as well. And maybe that doesn't appeal to us as much, but getting outside for a 10-minute break is going to make you feel better than just sitting around.
And you also mentioned how doctors now, general practitioners, telling people or beginning to tell people that instead of taking a drug for your depression or your stress or whatever, or going to see a stress specialist, go for a walk, go and look at a plant. Or so I think over here we call it social prescription. Is that right?
But I don't know if it's called social prescriptions, but I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, it's the doctors are saying go outside because we know that walking or doing any exercise, it increases our endorphins, and those are feel good chemicals, right? And then we know from looking at all of these studies that say, looking at a plant is going to make you feel better. I think a live plant is probably better, but if you don't have that, put a wallpaper on your computer or your phone of a plant and maybe you'll feel a little bit better.
Yeah, and you mentioned the endorphins. This is so the monks knew this. They didn't have Google, did they? So they
No.
knew instinctively that this was the way to design a property. And
Yeah.
you see it in universities, you see it in churches, you see the cloisters was that sort of open bit, wasn't it, that you
Mhm.
walk through, and then you have the lawn. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. And there's a really good book that I enjoy called The Extended Mind, which I read, I think it came out after my book, or at least it came out after my research for this book. And they were talking about the design of buildings that make you feel most productive. And it's not those little cubicle buildings, it's buildings that were built to look like monasteries. So there you go. It just keeps repeating.
keeps, yeah, it does. As the human condition as such doesn't change. This is what I mean, the worry that we were talking about earlier. And Emma,
Yeah.
you are a star. You have given an attempt to answer the question, and I think you're almost right. I'm not sure. We'll find out. We'll say it, and then we'll come to it eventually. Men need meat in order to be strong for reproduction. That's according to my culture, and Emma comes from Zimbabwe.
Uh,
Whereas fish helps women more in childbirth. It's rather complicated, but that's the difference. God, that's a great answer.
oh, that is a great answer. Wow, I'm gonna need to look more into that. That is
Yeah,
not the same answer that Saint Benedict gave, but I really like it.
it's not the same one because we'll get the same one from you at the end. But also a question from Emma here. From your research, were monks asexual?
Oh, Emma, what a good question. No, is the short answer. So it's very hard to be chaste for a long time. And we know that there are so many issues that have come out from that. If you look at, for example, criminal prosecutions of priests for problems, right?
Yeah.
We know that that's something that happens. So they were attempting to be chaste, but we can read between the lines and we can see times when that wasn't happening. So I talked about an overweight friar, for example, being a joke, a medieval joke saying these people are hypocritical. Some of their favorite stories, the humorous stories, were about monks who ate too much or had sex or had affairs or had almost concubines. So we know that not everyone was sticking to the chastity thing. Sometimes they would go into the orchard. Sometimes they'd have to lock the gate in the orchard because they go have a rendezvous out there with somebody. But then if you read the rule of St. Benedict very closely, he says that they were supposed to have baths, but that the older monks were not supposed to have baths with the younger monks. And I think we can read between the lines here that if you are chaste for a very long time,
Yeah.
a very handsome young man is going to be a temptation to you.
Yeah.
So, Emma, they were trying to be chaste, but many times they were not chaste.
Okay, so that was the human condition again overrides. So they would sneak out into the village or bring a village girl or a nun over the fence and into the orchard for a bit of hanky panky.
That's right. I mean, these like the whole like living as a monk thing, living in poverty, following like obedience to the letter, and living chastely, they are difficult. They are challenges, and that is why they are spiritually, if I don't know, they're spiritual athletes, right? Sometimes saints are talked about as spiritual
Yeah,
athletes because they're up against such a
yeah,
big challenge, and chastity is a big challenge.
yeah.
We know
No,
this.
I mean, absolutely. We are now going to move on to the element in in the wisdom of monks,
Okay,
food.
right.
Were they vegetarians? How did they eat?
They're supposed to be vegetarians much of the time, but we know that they weren't. So again, coming back to this hypocritical idea, they ate pretty well. They ate two times a day in summer, and then they ate once in the winter. And this was because they were praying, as we know, based on the canonical hours, which are the hours of daylight. So if you are working and praying over a longer day in the summer, you're going to need 2 meals. But they tended to be like pretty humble in that they're mostly carbs, right? Things like oatmeal and barley, porridge type stuff, but they didn't have to be really dull. I think there is this idea that in the Middle Ages, the food was not going to be very tasty. But I mean, they had the same vegetables that we do, at least for the most part. As long as they're not from the Americas, you could have a lot of the same vegetables and the same herbs, right? And if you just add onion and garlic to anything, it's going to elevate it for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Now we're going to move on to the question, which we're going to answer now. Thank you, Emma, for that. But you have a very interesting bit about what happens if you put a chunk of beef in front of a monk, as to what happens if you put a fish in front of a monk.
All right. So Saint Benedict says you're not supposed to eat the meat of quadrupeds if you can help it. And this is because quadrupeds have sex the way people have sex. So when you see a quadruped on your plate, you might be thinking of how it ended up there. So you might start thinking about sex. And then, as we know, that is a problem. Whereas fish don't have sex the same way, right? Fish do not have sex in the same positions. They don't really have sex at all. So when you look at a fish on your plate, you're not thinking about sex. And interestingly, there is a guy called John Wyatt Greenlee who studies eels and the way that eels show up in history for things like rent and things. And we still don't actually know how eels reproduce. So eels count as fish. They are fish. And those were good things to eat during the 40 days of Lent because they will not make you think about sex, whereas a cow might. And I think this, maybe we don't think about this because we don't have like a lifelong vow of chastity. But if you have had a lifelong vow of chastity and you're sitting looking at beef on your plate, maybe that is what is making you think randy thoughts. I don't know. But that is the reason Benedict says you're not really supposed to eat the meat of quadrupeds.
I don't think I've chuckled so much over in a book for a long time. But this chastity thing, which is very big in the Catholic Church amongst priests, which has caused all sorts of things. Plus, there's why? What was the purpose of having everybody chaste?
Well, it's that's a big question. It comes down to the fact that you're not really supposed to enjoy your body that much. It's just a vehicle, right? So the more pleasure you could give up to God, then the more holy you are, right? To enjoy things too much, like lust is one of the 7 deadly sins, right? You're only supposed to have sex for reproduction. And I think this goes back to Genesis, right? Where Eve is, well, they are ashamed that they are naked. And then like Eve has problems giving birth later on because of the apple and all that stuff. So you're not supposed to enjoy sex. You're only supposed to do it for reproduction.
So your body is your vehicle to be in touch with God, and the less you enjoy it or feel it or realize it, the better.
Yeah. So I mean, don't ask me why pleasure is a bad thing.
You're my guest.
But yeah, so it's basically tied to the fact that I think if it comes down to it, we're talking about things like property rights. And the more people have sex, the more children they will have, and the more complicated it is. And the more partners you have, the more complicated it is to figure out who owns what. So I think that there are a lot of rules that get set down by humans to try and keep things, keep the property in the family. And if we know who is having sex with who, we know whose children they are, then we know how this stuff is getting passed down. Where the more promiscuous you are, who knows, who these children belong to and, whose property this is. So I think pragmatically, if we step back from religion, I think this is like humans' way of controlling property and controlling what we own. But in terms of what the church fathers say, that was like informing monks, they were basically being like, this type of pleasure is not holy unless you are married and you are procreating and it's missionary. You're not allowed to have any sex that's not missionary. Yeah. That is sinful.
That makes, I got to say, when I looked at doing this show many months back, and I didn't think that this would be the one Goldster show I've done where sex has been talked about so much, because we're talking about monasteries, and Jean Joyce corroborates what I've just said. Henry VIII accused monks of having women in the monasteries and used this as part of the justification of the dissolution of the monasteries.
Yeah. Which, Henry, come on now.
Yeah, come on.
That's rich.
He had 6 wives.
I know. I don't think anyone can say that Henry was not a hypocrite. I think it's written all over him.
So if you're living in this chaste, obedient, and poverty-stricken monastery world, and you're eating fish and not meat because people want to control you and everything like that, the essence of your book is to sort of pluck stuff out that we can put on our lives today.
Yeah.
So give us an idea of the I mean, you've got a phrase here saying research has shown that we're happiest when we are living in alignment with our personal values and we're giving of ourselves in service to others. How does that reflect these sort of dodgy, hanky-panky, drunken monks in their monasteries?
Well, those are the monks that are not following the rule, right? They're not following the rule. But so we need to remember, like we're joking around a lot about them, but there are monks and nuns today, and their purpose is to serve God, and their purpose is to serve each other. And we can joke as much as we want because we are also people who enjoy, bending the rules. But they were trying to live a life of service, and I think it's very noble. And the thing about a monastic community is you are in there to serve God your whole life. Everything is meant to set you on that path, right? Everything you do is helping you to achieve salvation and to help your fellow monks. And I think we don't have to be religious, but we know what we value. If we value honesty, if we value integrity, if we value service or education, if those are the things that are meaningful to us, and we live according to those values, and we build our lives around that, like we build our homes to help us keep on that goal, or we build our relationships to help us keep on that goal. And then if we use it to help other people, that is what research has shown, modern research has shown, leads us to actual happiness. So there's a difference here. Monks were not trying to be happy. They were not aiming at happiness. We are. But some of the things that they use to keep themselves in balance and to keep themselves on track with their goals will keep us in balance and keep us on track with our goals without having, as I say in the book, without having to take a vow of chastity.
Yes. And actually, Jean Joyce has come in with a point that I was getting from that when you said the whole life is one of service to God, whereas is service to God also the service to the community? Jean Joyce is asking, although the monks were powerful, they also provided education, hospital care, and shelter to travelers. So where is the priority of that service?
Well, I mean, you are educating children to read and to hopefully read books that are going to help them with their salvation, right? And when we're talking about hospitals were not just about protecting the body or taking care of the body, but also they were ministering. So there are some hospitals, for example, in Jerusalem, where they would treat Muslims and they'd treat Jews, but they were also trying to get them to become Christians because they were concerned about their souls, right? Whether we agree with this or not, that was their purpose. And so we were talking about hospitals, we talked about education. What was the third thing? I can't remember.
Hospital care, shelter for travelers. You knock on the door and they give you a place to sleep and a bit of food, and that sort of thing. So they were the service thing and the idea of helping others or serving God brings you what endorphins that can de-stress you and give you happiness.
Yeah. So I think, and this is shaky ground for me because I haven't done enough research into this, but I think it has to do with empathy and even mirror neurons, right? So when we see somebody smiling, we want to smile, and it lights us up in the same way that it lights them up. So I think that service and our need for service is really like built into our biology. And the more we help other people, the better we feel. And this is probably to increase our social bonds, to help us like live against those saber-toothed tigers, right? Create a village that's going to keep us safe from the very moment that we become humans instead of, I don't know, Neanderthals or whatever we were before that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of books around about how you can your well-being through yoga, or your well-being through going to a Buddhist retreat, or your well-doing that. This is the first one I've seen about actually monks. So give us give us a sort of bullet point, as it were, of what I or you or any of our audience can take away, 3 or 4 things of how the Middle Ages monks lived that we can actually stamp onto our lives here.
Okay, so I think that a couple of the things that you just mentioned are right there. So figure out what is meaningful to you in life. So it's too hard to say, like, find out what your purpose is. That might be too much. What is meaningful to you in life, and keep that at the forefront of your life. So for monks, this is serving God. For you, it might be something else. It might be family, for example. So putting that at the forefront, keeping it there. And then, if you're not feeling well, help somebody else. That might help you a lot. Living close to nature, in that you are taking a walk through some trees, or you're letting your feet touch grass or something like that, is going to make you a little bit healthier. But then, now this is something we haven't talked about yet, but one of the most researched things that is in here is meditation. So just sitting quietly and not thinking, or at least trying to keep yourself just sitting there thinking about your breath, or thinking about just one thing, that has been shown to have huge, huge helpfulness in your life in the long term. So that people, for example, there's some research saying, if you have a 3 minute, gotta get really excited about this. If you have a 3 minute meditation habit, you're just sitting and breathing and thinking about nothing else, or just coming back if you get distracted, because we all get distracted, coming back to your breath for 3 minutes a day. Say you do this for a few weeks, the benefits will last you years. So I think one of the ways that monks are healthy is just by having these moments of silence to just contemplate maybe one thing at a time, and that we know will make us healthier.
That's fascinating. So meditation is different from praying, is it? When you say they pray X times a day,
Mhm.
that's a different thing from what you've just described.
Yeah, so some people think of it as praying is asking for something, and meditation is listening. And I think that's a good way to think about it. Whereas like prayer seems active, right? You're speaking to God, you're addressing the Virgin Mary or something, you are speaking. Whereas meditation, you're sitting and you're just trying not to think too much, and whatever thoughts are rising or ideas are rising, it's
Mhm.
almost more like listening than prayer is. At least that's how I distinguish the two. And I think it's a helpful distinction. It's more than like, it's not only me that thinks of it in these ways, and I think it is a different way,
And
an effective way of thinking about the two.
and do you meditate for 3 minutes a day?
My habit is not as regular, but I had a very good habit for a long time, and I do meditate when I need to, or when I feel I have a moment. Some people say if you don't have 20 minutes to meditate per day, then meditate for an hour every day. Like slow down.
So,
um,
what made you stop doing it, or able to
um,
flow out of it?
I'm a mom
Right.
and I have a new puppy. And so life gets in the way. And so, because you need to have a moment where you can just sit.
Yeah.
But so I don't have a practice where, like, at this time every day I do it. But I think I do meditate many times during the week just by sitting and not thinking.
Is
And
this the same as mindfulness
yeah,
that
yeah.
people are talking about? Emma mentions, oh, I like this. Do you feel that you are one of the chosen few who has been tasked by spiritual powers to bring this knowledge of medieval monks to the modern world? My personal belief is some authors are vehicles through which certain knowledge from the past is brought to life for benefit. Do you feel like that, Daniéle?
I would be honored to be one of those people. I've never thought of it in those terms. I just know that uh like, we're talking about living in alignment and living with purpose,
Yeah.
and I feel best, I feel like I'm doing what I'm meant to be doing when I talk to people about the humanity of our ancestors, right? The humanity of the people who lived before, because I don't think they get enough respect. I
Yeah.
don't think we are learning enough from our elders or our ancestors.
Mhm.
And so it is a mission, it is a vocation, Emma, in some ways, that I share this. And I didn't expect, as a medieval historian, that I would be bringing people peace with a book. But some people have emailed me and said, like, this book, I picked it up at the right time and it
Yeah.
helped me.
Now interesting. Emma does meditate for an hour every day.
Good for
I
you.
I don't. If anybody meditates and gets benefits from that, or the food that we discussed, which was fish and not meat, for various reasons, or the plants, just let us know. You seem to be a chosen vehicle. Emma's designated you as a chosen vehicle, Danielle, so that is it. We, on Goldster, you are a chosen vehicle. I want you to sit there for a couple of seconds, because I am telling everybody what is coming up next, and then we're going to return to you, because you are coming to Great Britain, and we want to know when, where, and how we can find you. We are, and my screen has just disappeared, so here we go. Tomorrow, April 21st, that is tomorrow, we're going to be live at Riverstone on the banks of the River Thames in Fulham, and Goldster is welcoming back Jane Thinn, the author of Widowland and Queen High, just out, which is among one of the most critically acclaimed duets of novels in recent years, because it's an alternate history where instead of a Nazi defeat, there has been a grand alliance between Great Britain and Germany. And Queen High is Wallace Simpson, the American who went off with the man who was meant to be king. So that's going to be great. That is live. So I think that if you want to go, try emailing concierge@goldster.co.uk, and Joe will tell you if there are any seats left. If not, just say you're a friend of mine and I'll get you in. April 27th, I'm with Peter Popham and his boundary-breaking novel, India Be Damned, a novel of partition. That is a fictional account of India's violence, independence, colonialism. We do a lot, and how that went wrong. April 28th, book of the month, and by a hair's breadth of a popular Goldster vote, it is Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis, a salesman who one day wakes up as a cockroach on his back, and the family tensions that follow, and what it means in the lives for all of us. Have you read Metamorphoses, or do you know Kafka, Danielle?
I have read 2 of his stories, and one was that. And I didn't expect to like it, and I did. I thought it was funnier than I was expecting, and it did make me think. Although it's been a long time since I read it. I liked it, though.
Yeah, it's well, I'll let you know. You can see that this will go out on the. Oh no, it doesn't. This one doesn't go out on podcast, but I'll send you a link. If you're around, you can join in the show and tell us about it. Now, you have a new book coming out.
That's right.
Don't you, in September? Tell us about that book and what we can discuss about it.
So this is a follow-up to How to Live Like a Monk, but it is nowhere near as interested in like wellness. This is called Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World. And this was challenging because I was looking at etiquette, basically, and chivalry in the Middle Ages. And can we take any of that forward to our time and use it? How can that influence us today? What is consistent and what is different?
Well, good manners helps, doesn't it?
Always, always.
But we don't have good manners now. We just kick and scream and complain.
I think we still have to keep our elbows off the table, though. And that is something that people in the Middle Ages did, too.
I remember, you reminded me of that after years, the elbows on the table. Yes, we do have to keep that. But I think you would have a lot to tell in that, because people do treat people quite badly now. They think they can get away with things. Rudeness, particularly in our politics, is accepted, isn't it? Whereas before, they just cut each other's heads off. Is that right?
Guillotines are past my time. It was hangings mostly.
And in the summer, July, you're going to be in Britain. Why are you coming? You're going to a festival. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the end of June, on June 26th, which is actually my birthday, I will be at the Chalk Valley History Festival that's near Salisbury, which is like I think it's the biggest festival in the UK for history. And I will be speaking about how to live like a monk on the Monday, the 26th.
Monday the 26th. And then are you doing any other shows or anything in there? I'm just going to put all your details in the chat again whilst you tell us that. In London, any lectures?
I will be
doctorates.
If anyone wants to give me a doctorate, I will take it. I don't have any appearances planned right now, but it's still April and I have time to plan some things. You can always find me on social media at 5MIN Medievalist, because I used to write under 5-Minute Medievalist. I'm basically on all the social media platforms. So if there's more dates that I'm doing in London, for example, I will let you know.
Okay, that's brilliant. All the social media things are up there for anybody that wants to copy that down for the moment. Now, Goldster, we have a specific mission, which is a little bit like seeing a plant and going out, social prescriptions, as we said. Don't take the Prozac, go out and for a walk, go to the gym, go for a cycle ride or something. Give me one top line nugget from the wisdom of monks that fix that.
I would
Mission.
say, I would say lean on your community. Use your community to help you reach your goals, because that is what monks were doing as well. They were trying to reach a spiritual goal, and they did it in community because a community can help you get there.
The community, what a brilliant ending that we've got. Daniéle, that's it. Time's winged chariot has flown by. Thank you for taking us such on a vivid journey into the Middle Ages. I never thought we'd touch on those topics that we lingered on. Thank you, Emma, particularly for having a stab at that, and for everybody's contribution. Jean Joyce says, great guest, thank you. And Denise saying, thank you for a brilliant session, and a few others have come in there. Thank you for our podcast listeners who will be catching up on this later. And if anybody wants to try to get into tomorrow's event, it's concierge@goldster.co.uk. That's with Jane Thin. And until then, stay curious, stay looking at plants, stay having a walk, stay being nice to people, stay safe, and of course, stay Goldster. Goodbye, Daniéle Cybulskie. What a lovely enigmatic guest you have been in your black headphones and red booth. Bye.